Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So you may have heard the news, but the developer of ArkOS custom firmwares has decided to stop development on the RG351P and the RG351M devices. And while that may sound disappointing at first, I think that there's a good opportunity here to kind of explain the reasoning behind it. And really there are two different things going on. The first point is that there are some internal issues with these two devices that really frustrate this developer. And rightfully so. Without getting into too many details, these two devices in particular have a very hard time waking up from sleep because of the type of controller that they use internally. And the second part to this is the fact that this is actually a very mature firmware. Just like with the 351 Elect custom firmware, ArkOS has been stable for almost 6 months now, and so a lot of the bugs and tweaks have already been worked out. So regardless of whether or not development is stopping, this is a very capable and mature firmware. And if you're a big fan of ArkOS and you still want to see where this development goes, you have plenty of other options. For example, the developer still plans on working on devices like the Powkiddy RGB10, the RK2020, and the Odroid Go Advance. And personally, I'm a huge fan of the RGB10, so I'm happy that he's going to continue developing on it. And maybe the icing on the cake is the fact that he still plans on working on the Anbernic RG351V. And that's really exciting to me because I've really grown to enjoy this device, mostly because of its beautiful 640 by 480 display. So ArkOS is not dead in any way, it's just not going to be further developed for the RG351P and the 351M. So that leaves me in kind of a unique position, because now I get to make a guide that's a definitive final guide for this firmware on these two devices. It's probably no secret that the RG351P is still my favorite device of all time, and I'm a huge fan of ArkOS too, so I'm pretty excited to get down to the nitty-gritty with you here today, and to show you how to set up ArkOS on a 351P using a guide that isn't going to be outdated 2 weeks, 2 months, or even a year from now. So if you're just tuning in and it's been a while since I posted this video, you're actually in luck, because this is going to be the most updated video you can find, because all the things we're going to go over here in this video are going to be relevant later on. So we have a ton of ground to cover, and I'm going to try to keep this under 30 minutes. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Alright, let's start with the easy stuff first. If you already have ArkOS installed on your device, all you have to do is just update it through the online tool. So make sure you're connected to your Wi-Fi, go into Options, and then go down to Update, and then you'll be greeted with this update screen here. Go ahead and type in OK, and then hit the check mark on the bottom right. That's going to start the update process, and this is going to be your final update. Once it runs through, you're actually done. If you look here on the bottom, it says distribution version ArkOS 351P and M final. And that's it, you're dismissed. Thanks to all the ArkOS veterans for watching. Now for everybody else who's never installed it before, let's do it from scratch. We're going to start here with the ArkOS GitHub page. Now this has a very comprehensive wiki page here, so I encourage you to read through it and kind of get an idea of what ArkOS is all about. Also, make sure you go to the emulators and ports page. Here you're going to find every system that it supports, what emulator they use, what folder you're supposed to put the ROMs in, what file extension you're supposed to use for each of those ROMs, and then whatever BIOS are required in order to make those ROMs run. If you're having any problems getting any game to run, I would recommend you go to this page first, make sure that all of these parameters are working correctly. It's a super handy tool. Now speaking of super handy, he also has a frequently asked question specific to the RG351P and RG351M. And in here you can find all sorts of information. For example, how to access your device wirelessly from your computer, so you can drag and drop files without having to use your SD card. How to set up your own background music, how to set up your own splash screen when you're launching a game, and all of the hotkeys you need to know as well. So definitely read through this at least once. Now before we get started with the installation itself, I want to point out here that the developer now has a donate link on his page. So if you have the means and the inclination, I would encourage you to send a couple bucks his way. Like I mentioned, he's been working on this for free with his spare time for over 6 months at this point. And I think it's the least we can do is to give him a little bit of thanks. Okay, let's get started on the installation now. So on this front wiki page here, you're going to scroll almost all the way down and you're going to find all the download links. Now you'll find the specific section with RG351P and RG351M, and you will have Google Drive or Mega links. I prefer Google Drive, so we're going to use that one. Just click on Google Drive and then select download. It's going to give you all sorts of warnings about how it can't scan for viruses or whatever. Just go ahead and click download anyway. Okay, once you've downloaded the file, which is going to be about 3 gigabytes altogether, go ahead and open it up on your computer and then extract this 7Z file. I found that the best thing to do when flashing an image file like this is to unzip it first. So you can go ahead and delete the zip file at that point, And there you are, you have your IMG file, which is going to be about 7 gigs altogether. So there's a variety of software tools you can use, Balena Etcher, Win32 Disk Imager, things like that. Personally, I've been using Rufus lately, I really like it. So all these tools do the same thing. Identify which SD card you want to flash everything to. I've put in a 128 gig card, you can see here. And then press the select button, find that image file, and then just go ahead and press start. It's going to give you a warning and say, do you really want to do this? And you say, yeah, man, I want to do it. It'll take a few minutes to write this image to the SD card. And then once you're done, go ahead and eject the SD card. You're going to see 2 different partitions. It doesn't matter which one you eject. Getting back to our device here, let's go ahead and put the SD card in and boot it up. This first boot is going to take a while. It's actually going to finish the installation for you. Okay, you're going to get greeted by a screen here that's going to say, hey, we're going to expand this card, or we're going to convert it to exFAT, all this stuff. Just go ahead and hit OK. And then just give it a few minutes. It's going to run through the entire script and finish the installation for you. Once you see the homepage like this, your installation is done. But you will find that there are no games or anything else on this firmware. So there's really not much you can do until you add games. But one thing you can do is you can go into UI settings and change out the theme. And all these themes are preloaded on ArkOS, which makes it very handy. You don't have to download them or anything else like that. And I would encourage you to experiment and find one that you like. I'm just going to go back to the default one just to make things easier for everyone. Once you're ready to add games to it, go ahead and press Start, then navigate to the Quit menu, and then select Shut Down System. ArkOS also has a hotkey where you can push R3, which is the right analog stick, plus the power button. It'll also do a safe shutdown, which is a really handy shortcut. Okay, let's take that SD card out and put it back into our computer. So when you plug the card into your computer, you're going to have 2 different SD card partitions pop up. This first one, which is called the boot partition, you're not really going to need that one. What we really want to focus on is the EasyROMs partition. And this is going to have all the folders where you put all your games. But there are some other things you need to add as well. Let's start with the BIOS folder. Now I've already grabbed the stock BIOS folder from the original SD card on my device. So if you have that, I would use those files and move them over to your BIOS folder. But like I mentioned before, if you go to that wiki page and it'll say specifically what BIOS files are needed for what system, you can use that instead. If it says anything about replacing files, just select skip this file. After that, it's just a matter of adding in your games. So for example, here are all my Game Boy games. I'm going to go into the Game Boy folder, which is the GB folder, and I'm going to move them over. And you just rinse and repeat at this point. Whatever ROM library you have, just move them over to the SD card. Here I am with NES games, moving over again with Super Nintendo games, and so on and so forth. So let's talk about some of the other things you can add to your SD card. For example, you can add background music while you're navigating through the menus. What you want to do is grab whatever MP3 you want to use, and then you want to save it into the BG Music folder. And it doesn't matter what name you give it, but I would recommend using a name that allows you to recognize what song it is. You can also make a custom splash screen when you're loading up games. Now you just need to make a JPEG which is 480 by 320 pixels with a 24-bit depth. And it needs to be named loading.jpg, and it has to be all lowercase. And you're going to put it in the launch images folder. There's already going to be a file called loading.jpg. What I usually do is I call that one loading1.jpg, and then I add my new one there instead. Now another thing you should probably do is install Amberports. This is very easy, and I'll have a link to this in my written guide in the video description. All you have to do is go to this GitHub page, click on that download zip button, then download the zip that they're talking about, and then extract those files. It's going to be a folder and an SH file, and you're going to move both the folder and the SH file over into this ports folder. And that's it. Now you've installed Amberports, and we'll play around with this later in the video. Now a new feature in ArkOS is that you can play movie files. So all you have to do is grab an AVI or an MP4 or an MPG file, and then put them in the videos folder. I don't really have any videos on this computer, so I'm just going to grab one of my old YouTube intros, and I'll demonstrate that later in this video as well. So once you've moved all your games and other files over onto your SD card, go ahead and eject the SD card again and put it back into your device. Now one of the first things I like to do with new firmware is to take the device online. You do this in the options menu within ArkOS. Now, if you're using an RG351P, you're probably going to have to use an OTG cable, which is basically a USB-A to USB-C, and then also a Wi-Fi dongle. All you have to do is connect these together and then hook them into your device. Now, personally, I'm lucky I have a Wi-Fi chip inside of my RG351P, but that is very rare. Either way, once you have the ability to connect to the internet, let's connect to the internet. Go into the Wi-Fi menu, and then delete this connection here. You just select it and then go down to delete. And then hit the R1 button, and then hit that plus button there. And then find whatever Wi-Fi network you are, put in your password, and now you're connected. You're going to go to that X menu to get out. And there you are. Up there you can see I have a little network icon. Now while we're in this options menu, let's show you one of the things you can do in the advanced folder. In here there's an option that says ES full screen, which stands for Emulation Station Full Screen. If you see on ArkOS, it has that top bar up above, which gives you your sound and your brightness and your battery levels. But if you don't want that, you can select this ES full screen. And now all of a sudden you have a much cleaner screen. But as you can see, it's also showing the name of the song that's playing in the background music. So that's an easy fix as well. You just press start, go to sound settings, and then under display song titles, you turn that off. There we are, we have a super clean interface now, no distractions. Now the way ArkOS works is you basically navigate to your system and then you select your game within that system. But you see when we pick up a system here, we're not seeing any box art or anything else like that. So that's an easy fix too. You're going to go into Scraper, and then change this scrape from option to screen scraper. Within here, I like to use Box 2D as my image source, and then I like to make sure I scrape videos as well. You're also going to want to have a username and password, which you can get from screenscraper.fr, which is free to sign up, very handy. Okay, then you select scrape now, and then I'm just going to do 32x right here, and then you just hit start and let it run. Now you don't have to scrape everything on your device itself, you can actually scrape it directly on your SD card, and I have a video about that, so check that out if you want to try that way instead. Once it's done, it's going to say something about update your games list. And a lot of people ask, how do I update my games list? And it's actually pretty easy. You go into the quit menu, and then you just restart Emulation Station. That updates your games list for you. There we are. Now let's go back to that Sega 32X folder. And look at that, we have this beautiful box art, and if you wait a moment, it's going to play a video as well. This is one of my favorite things about these Emulation Station firmwares, is just how beautiful it is to navigate through everything. And each of these themes are going to be a little bit different too. Okay, one last step before we get into the games themselves, let's configure RetroArch. So go into the RetroArch menu and then select the first RetroArch option. Within here, select Settings, then Drivers, then Menu, and change it from this RGUI to XMB. That's going to be the layout that most people are familiar with when it comes to RetroArch. Once you've changed that, go back to the main menu, go to Configuration File, Save Current Configuration. And then just go ahead and quit RetroArch and boot it back up. And there we are, now we have the XMB theme. So let's go in here into Settings, then Video. And then one of the things I recommend is making sure that your aspect ratio under scaling is set to core provided. This means the aspect ratio on your games are going to be set by the emulator. Really handy. Another thing I like to do with these two devices in the video settings is to turn on RGA scaling. This is going to smooth out some of the distorted pixels that happen when you try to play retro games on a 3:2 aspect ratio screen, like on these two devices. Once you've made those changes, go back into Configuration File, Save Current Configuration, and you're good to go. Let's quit out of RetroArch and let's boot up a game. So going into the Nintendo menu, let's start up Mario 3. Ooh, nice splash screen. Okay, so you can see here, Mario 3 is running at a 4:3 aspect ratio. That's what the core says is the right aspect ratio, and I agree. You can also see that the text is pretty smooth here, and that's thanks to the RGA scaling. Let's turn off RGA scaling so you can see what it's like. We're going to hit Select and X to get into the menu and navigate to that same video settings again. And look at that, you can see just how ugly that text is. Look at the one-player game. You can see how the black and the white are just so offset. And that's because the resolution and the aspect ratio of this screen in particular doesn't play well with 4:3 classic consoles. So RGA scaling for the most part is going to fix all those issues, but I personally think there are better ways to do it as well. Let me show you how to do that. Go back into the quick menu, go into Shaders, then Load, and then pull up this Shaders folder here. And let's start with one that's very common. It's called Sharp Bilinear 2x Prescale. You're going to find it in the Interpolation folder, and there it is right there. So all you have to do is hit A to turn this on, and then let's resume the game through the quick menu. And look at that, I think it's a very balanced picture here. You can see the text is much easier to read. This is a good compromise when it comes to this screen in particular. So I think that you can probably just use RGA scaling to make things easier on you, but if you want to go through and also enable these shaders, you can do that too. Now personally, I like one specific shader when it comes to SNES. So we're going to go back into the shaders folder, we're going to go into the scale NX folder, and then we're going to turn on the scale 2x shader. So I really like this one. It has a more stylized feel to it. It kind of rounds out a lot of the edges, but I like how this one looks. It's not quite the most pure image in the world, but for me, it's a lot of fun to play with this. Okay, so let's imagine here that you've been playing around with different shaders and you figured out the right thing for you. So you want to jump into the quick menu and go to this section called overrides. This is how we're going to save things. You have three different options here. The first is save core override. This basically means that anytime you use this specific emulator or core, it's going to save these settings that you have right now. So anytime you use Nestopia, that's what you're going to see. The next one is save content directory override. That basically means anytime you play a game from the NES folder, it's going to save these settings. And finally, you have save game override. So if you have one specific game where you want to have specific settings, that's the one you'll select. Personally, I like to use the save content directory overrides because I flip through these cores very often. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't save every little thing for you. You also have to save the shaders themselves. So back in that shaders menu, underneath the load option, there's a save option. And within here, you're going to have the same three options: save core preset, save content directory preset, and save game preset. Just like with the other one, I like to use the content directory preset. Now, once you have these two saved, you're good to go. So here I am with Mario 2. It has the scale 2x shader, as well as the correct aspect ratio, as well as RGA scaling turned off. You can't use shaders and RGA scaling at the same time. So let's just test it cold on a game. Here's Mario Bros. 1. After we get through that beautiful splash screen, you'll see that it jumps right into the game. And it's running perfectly. It has the 4:3 aspect ratio, and it's running the scale 2x shader. So now anytime I use any NES game, it's going to have those settings saved. Perfect. So let's move on to another system. Here's Super Nintendo. I've already gone and turned off RGA scaling, and you can see it's just a mess. Look at that text, it looks so ugly. So easy fix here, we're going to go into shaders again, and we're going to select scale 2x. And look at that, it looks beautiful. So now that we have everything the way we want it to look, let's go ahead and save things. We'll start with the shaders this time. So I'm going to go into save, and then save content directory preset. This is going to save the scale 2x shader. Then I'm going to go back and down to overrides and then save content directory overrides. So now when I boot up a different game like Super Mario Kart, everything works perfectly. It all looks great. Now there are other tweaks you need to do for Super Nintendo in order to make sure all the games work perfectly. Let's take one that's really hard to run like Mario World 2. This one's going to require a different emulator core. So you press select while you're hovering over the game, and then you go to edit this game's metadata. And in there, go to emulator, change that to RetroArch, and then change the core to SNES 9X 2010. This is not the default core, but this is the one that works best for games that are hard to play like Mario World 2, Mario RPG, and Final Fantasy 3. So just like that, we're opening up Yoshi's Island here. And not only is it using the Scale 2X filter because we saved it by content directory and not by core, but if you go into the quick menu, you can see that the 2010 core is running instead. So perfect, we got all that set up now. Let's move on to other systems. Here's Nintendo 64. Now the unique thing about Nintendo 64 is that it's kind of hard to play on any of these systems, but also ArkOS gives you many options when it comes to emulators. Personally, I like to use the two standalone emulators you see on the bottom here, the Rice one and the Glide one. Typically, I will start with the Glide one and see how a game plays, and then I'll change it to the Rice one in case the Glide one doesn't work very well. So let's go in and start F-Zero using the Glide emulator. And it's running pretty well. I would say this is running at about 90, maybe 95% speed. Now, unfortunately, these two standalone emulators don't have the ability to use any of the RetroArch hotkeys, so you can't show your frames per second or things like that. Let's change it to the Rice emulator and see how it runs. And look at that, this is running at probably 98% speed. I'm actually seeing very little slowdown when it comes to gameplay and just a tiny bit of audio issues. But overall, that's running really well for such a low-powered chipset. Let's work on some other tweaks really quick. Let's start with Game Boy. So in this one of the things that bothers me about it is that it shows a black and white screen. So what you can do is go into the quick menus and then into options, and we can adjust some of those things. And I have an entire guide about this called my Handheld Systems Guide, which you can also find on this channel. But what you want to do is change your Game Boy colorization to internal, and then you also want to adjust your interframe blending to say LCD ghosting accurate. Now in the internal palette section, you can actually change it to hundreds of different colors. I'm just going to stick with the default DMG color here, which is going to mimic the original Game Boy. And you can add things like bezels to the sides of this and everything else, and all that's in that guide. But for now, I think this looks really great. Another tricky one is Game Boy Advance. The RG351P and the RG351M can scale Game Boy Advance perfectly, but as you can see, it doesn't look perfectly right out the gate, and that's because RGA scaling is on. So I went through the menus and I turned it off, and this is what it looks like instead, and it looks just about perfect. The image is much cleaner when you turn off that RGA scaling because it doesn't need it. Now if you want, you can also add shaders to Game Boy Advance. There are two shaders that I recommend. They're called Bevel and LCD3X, and they're found in the Handhelds folder. And these give a little bit of a grid overlay onto the screen itself, and it makes it feel more like you're playing like one of those old school LCD displays. And it's very subtle, but here's the Bevel shader, and it looks great. Okay, moving on to Nintendo DS, there's not a lot of tweaking we can do here, but I wanted to point out that L2 will change the different screens so you can swap between the top and bottom screens. And if you hit the L3 button, it'll show you the menu here. And unfortunately, the text is super tiny and you can't change that, but basically those are the two things you need to remember. L2 to change your screen and L3 to get into the menu. In general, most of the Nintendo DS games play okay. The only issue is that you can mostly only play games that don't require a touchscreen. So Mario Kart is a good example of one that works well. To exit the game, all you have to do is get into the menu and then select Exit Drastic. Okay, moving on to some harder systems here, let's do Dreamcast next. By default, my favorite Dreamcast emulator is not set, so you need to go and set it yourself. You go into Emulator Settings and change the emulator to say Retro Run 32, and then for the core, change it to Flycast 32 Rumble. And I have an entire video about this one as well, and this is by far the best way to emulate Dreamcast on these devices. So even games like Virtua Tennis 2, which are very hard to emulate, runs relatively smoothly. It's not going to be perfect, but it's quite impressive for such a low-powered device like the RG351P and RG351M. And finally, the last system which is really going to push your device to its limits is the PSP. To get into the menu, you're going to hit L2, and these are the options I recommend you change. Go into frame skipping and set it to 1. Change your frame skipping type to number of frames, and make sure your force max FPS is either 60 or below 60. I would start with 60 and then move it down depending on how the game performs. And then finally, if you want to see more information, go all the way down to the bottom and then select Show FPS Counter and change that to both. That'll give you the most information as you're playing to make sure your game's running smoothly. And it's no miracle worker or anything else like that, but you can definitely play a lot of racing games and 2D games pretty well on the PSP. Just don't expect to play games like God of War. And I sound like a broken record at this point, but I also have a PSP guide on this channel as well, so just dig through my guides, you're going to find everything you need. Now in terms of games, let's also talk about ports for a little bit. One of the new things with this final release of ArkOS is that it now supports the Sonic mobile ports. And I did a video on this for Emulate 4.0 in particular, which is a different firmware, but now this follows the exact same process. I really love these ports because they play at 60 frames per second, and they take up the entirety of the 3x2 display. They look beautiful. Now if you remember, I had you install Amber ports earlier, so let's open that up and see what that's like. Now Amber ports basically allows you to navigate through various ports that this developer has set up for you, and if you choose to install any of these games, it's going to install the shell that you need, and then you move over all the retail game files so that you can boot the game itself. But he also has some open source games like this AM2R game here. This one you don't need to move any files over, it has everything contained. So all you have to do is select install, and then once it's done, go ahead and exit out of Amber ports. And then if you go back into the port section, there it is, AM2R. And we can just boot it right up, and there we go. AM2R stands for Another Metroid 2 Remake. This is a complete remake of the original Game Boy game Metroid 2 Return of Samus. It's beautiful. If you also remember, we added a video file to the SD card. So let's go into the videos folder and let's boot it up. And like I mentioned, it's just a YouTube intro, but it shows you that you can play videos on here. I've read that you want to keep the resolution down to 720p or below. You don't want to put big files onto this device. But if you want to play movies or TV shows or something like that, you can do that in ArkOS now. Now, even though ArkOS development is going away for these two devices, you can still update your cores through RetroArk. So you go into Online Updater and then Update Installed Cores. And you can just run this periodically, and it's going to download and install the latest builds for these cores on your RetroArk. You can still get the latest and greatest emulators and cores, and it's possible that this might improve performance over time. Okay, final thing to show off here is that if you hit select while you're in the ArkOS menu, it's going to start a screensaver. And I love these screensavers. It's going to basically go through all of your scraped videos and show off all the games you have available to play. And if you want to actually play any of these, all you have to do is hit the start button and it's going to boot right into the game. This is one of my favorite features of all time, and I love that ArkOS puts it front and center. Alright, this has been a long one here. I really appreciate you sticking around, but this is really the end. So yeah, this is the final build of ArkOS for the RG351P and the RG351M. There's a lot to love about ArkOS, and just because it's not being updated anymore doesn't mean that all of this stuff isn't an incredible value for you and your device. At the end of the day, I'm just incredibly thankful that we have this resource available to us, and that somebody took the time and spent 6 months to make this little device so much better than it was when it first shipped to us. And a lot of people ask me, should I go with ArkOS or 351elec? And that's a very personal decision. Personally, I feel that 351elec is more tailored to new users and people who just want a streamlined gaming experience. But ArkOS is really meant for those who really want to get under the hood and tweak every last setting to make it personally their own. And when it comes down to it, I tend to use ArkOS more often than 351elec because I'm a tinkerer at heart. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Be sure to let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And I'd love it if you liked and subscribed if you found this helpful. And we will see you next time. Happy gaming.